Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the Kepler Lectures organized by the Center for Planet Habitability, Department of Geosciences in this university. My name is Carmen Gaina, and I have the great pleasure to introduce our very special guest and lecturer for today, Professor Carol Cleland. She's a professor of philosophy at the University of Colorado Boulder, but also the spoke leader at Leverhulme Center for Life in the Universe, Cambridge, UK. And Professor Cleland has a very wide background and interest in the natural sciences, spanning from astronomy and earth history to biology, mathematics, and physics. Professor Cleland, she received a bachelor in mathematics from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and her PhD in philosophy from Brown University. Her previous affiliations include a postdoctoral fellowship at Stanford University Center for the Study of Language and Information. She's a founding member of the University of Colorado Center for Astrobiology, the director of the Center for the Study of Origins, University of Colorado Boulder, the former director.
Former, yeah. No, they decided we didn't get external funding, so they killed it.
And a member of the NASA Astrobiology Institute from 1998 to 2009. So what is very special about Carol is that she is interested in the philosophy of science and logic, having this wonderful background in mathematics, biology, physics, astronomy, and everything. She has published many books and papers, and I'm just mentioning two books: The Quest for a Universal Theory of Life, Searching for Life as We Don't Know It, and The Nature of Life, Classical and Contemporary Perspective from Philosophy and Science. So Carol came to Norway for the first time, yes, this week, and she had a lot of discussions with colleagues from the Center for Planet Habitability, and she decided to change the topic a bit of her talk today, and is going to be more about how anomalies drive scientific discovery, and that will also cover some of the life questions that they were mentioned in the previous title. With this, I would like to invite Carol to tell us about the anomalies.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So my interest in anomalies grew out of my book, The Quest for a Universal Theory of Life, where I was challenged, this will connect it with the original title, I was challenged by NASA scientists after I argued it was a mistake to define life and that we currently weren't in any position to have a universal theory of life. They said, well, how the hell are we going to recognize it if we encounter it, if we don't have a definition or theory? And so I thought a lot about that, and I came up with the idea that what we should be searching for is not life per se, but rather potentially biological anomalies, using tentative versus defining criteria. And that led me to a more general exploration of the role of anomalies in scientific discovery. And there's a book, which should be out about this time next year, that is a collection of essays that Michael Dietrich, who's a philosopher of biology at Pittsburgh, and I are editing, and I have a paper in it, and so does he, by historians, philosophers, and scientists. Many of them are very eminent scientists on anomalies in science. So that ties it all together and perhaps explains the change in title. So what I want to do at the very beginning is give you an overview. I always like overviews about where we're going. And basically, where we're going is, I want to start, and I'm glad there's at least one philosopher here. I want to start with just a brief history of philosophical thought about anomalies in science, because it turns out there isn't much, except for the work of Thomas Kuhn. There's very little talk, particularly in the early part of the 20th century, about the role of anomalies, or even just about anomalies and what they are in science. And yet at that period of time, the early part of the 20th century, scientists were talking about anomalies. They were using the word anomalies. There were temperature anomalies. They were very concerned about anomalies in various contexts. And yet philosophers of science, people like Hempel, Popper, Carnap, are just silent. They don't use it. I actually explored the literature of Popper, and I couldn't find one use of the word anomaly. There is a rumor he used it once, and I couldn't find it. So if anybody finds it, let me know. But it's very mysterious why anomalies are so, shall we say, ignored in terms of their role in scientific practice by philosophers. And I have some views about that, which I'll begin my talk talking about. And then I'm going to look at some historical examples of anomalies in science. And one thing I'm going to do that's different than Thomas Kuhn did, he focused on physics and chemistry. And I am really interested in planetary science, the geosciences, and biology. So I'm going to be drawing out anomalies from those fields and comparing and contrasting them with anomalies in physics and chemistry. Because I think it's in all of these different fields of science, and I'm focusing on the natural sciences, you see talk about anomalies, but it's not always the same. And then I want to draw some lessons from the history of science about the role of anomalies in scientific discovery. Kuhn thought they played a role, but the role he saw them as playing is very different than the role that I think they play. And I'm going to kind of give you a new philosophical theory about the role of anomalies in scientific discovery, or at least be able to adumbrate, to sketch such a theory. And then I'm going to get really, I'm going to, shall we say, be a bit provocative. I'm going to talk about some contemporary examples of potential scientific anomalies, some of which are fairly controversial and may make some people say, what? Why is she talking about that? That's clearly not a real phenomenon. You'll see that when I talk about them, that they are things that fit into the count of how anomalies are recognized, acknowledged, and then solved and resolved in scientific practice. So let's begin with the first, a brief history of philosophical thought about anomalies in science. So intuitively speaking, if you're just thinking about what an anomaly is, it's a phenomenon that's surprising, unanticipated, or unexpected. But clearly the description I just gave you is inadequate for talking about anomalies in science. Why? Because what's unexpected to a layperson and what's unexpected to a scientist who's a specialist in the area may be very different. So it's much too qualitative and much too relative to the speaker's background as stated here. So the point is, the concept of anomaly is conditional on the beliefs of human beings. No phenomena is anomalous per se. Something is anomalous only in a context of a certain set of well-entrenched scientific beliefs, if you're talking about science. And a scientific phenomenon is a phenomenon that resists explanation within well-entrenched scientific framework of beliefs, which include theory, background assumptions, conditions of observation, and instrumentation. If you are familiar with Kuhn's work, this sounds like I'm talking about a paradigm, but I'm really not. I would prefer to call it a theoretical framework, and as we continue, you'll see why. So, leading pre-Kuhnian, before Kuhn, who introduced the word anomaly really into philosophy of science and the talk about it, and it really hasn't moved much beyond Kuhn, as I'm going to argue, philosophical views about the nature of scientific anomalies were kind of, nobody talked about them before Kuhn. If they did, it was very rare. It didn't play a central role. And I think I know why, and I'm just going to throw this out. It'll be in the chapter I'm writing for this book I told you about with Michael Dietrich in more detail, and I hope eventually to have a book on how anomalies drive scientific discovery. So 20th century logical empiricists, don't worry if you haven't heard about the logical empiricists, and falsificationists, everybody knows about Popper, so I'm talking about Popperians with falsificationists. They rarely use the term anomaly. I think they viewed them as especially surprising failed predictions. And if you believe that anomalies are just especially surprising failed predictions, then they famously fall into the context of discovery as opposed to the context of justification. And most of these early philosophers of science believed that the context of discovery, how you discover a phenomenon, is outside of the domain of philosophy, which could concentrate on the logic or the justification of theories and hypotheses by scientific evidence. So I think that's why, and I'm just throwing this out here at this stage, I don't have time to defend it, they viewed it in that way. Interestingly, Norman Hansen is an exception. He followed C.S. Peirce, the 19th century philosopher, in viewing anomalies as requiring a very special kind of logic. It's called, by Peirce and others, abduction, or inference to the best explanation, is sometimes identified with abduction. But for Peirce and for Hansen, abduction is a third kind of logic. You have induction, you have deduction, and then you have abduction, which is all about explanation instead of inferring hypotheses on the basis of evidence. I don't have time to go into detail, but I know there's at least one philosopher here, so I'm going to expand on that just a little bit. So with that exception, Hansen tries to come up with a logic of abduction. It's generally agreed he failed to do so, but it's the case that he was talking about this early on. So let's talk about Kuhn, because Kuhn's the one who played the big role in introducing the concept of anomaly into science. And here are quotes from Kuhn. He distinguished what he called normal science, which he thought went on in 99.9% of what goes on in laboratories and in field work, although he never talked about field work. He was focused on physics and chemistry and laboratory science. And revolutionary science. And he thought that normal science and revolutionary science were really different. And in normal science, that was what distinguished science from non-science. And in revolutionary science, scientists behave like philosophers. I don't want to go into detail about the distinction here, but what's really important is that normal science is very dogmatic. And there's a great deal of resistance to change in science on Kuhn's account. So I have some quotes relevant to the concept of anomaly that Kuhn developed. He says, normal science, the activity in which most scientists inevitably spend all of their time, is predicated on the assumption that the scientific community knows what the world is like. This is the dogmatism that is associated with Kuhn. Quote, again, another quote, every problem that normal science sees as a puzzle can be seen from another viewpoint as a counterinstance, a contradiction, an anomaly. So again, this kind of fits with the idea that a failed prediction is what people before Kuhn were thinking of as anomalies, and thus is a source of crisis. And the concept of crisis is critical for Kuhn's account of science because a crisis is the transition from normal science to revolutionary science, although going into a crisis where you're doubting your paradigm or your theoretical framework doesn't necessarily lead to a revolution. And the most important part is, for our purposes for this discussion, is his concept of the theory-ladenness of perception. So he says the assimilation of a previously anomalous visual field, he's talking about perception here, has reacted upon the changing the field itself, literally as well as metaphorically. The man accustomed to inverting lenses has undergone a revolutionary transformation of vision. So he believed that scientists, when they're engaged in normal science, the vast majority of what is going on, they really couldn't even recognize that a phenomenon was anomalous. They saw it as puzzling, a phenomenon that would eventually be solved with the resources of the well-entrenched scientific beliefs, the paradigm that scientists held, and they wouldn't consider it to be a threat to that paradigm or to the reigning theory. And so for Thomas Kuhn, literally what a scientist sees is conditioned by the theories and other assumptions that the scientist holds. So some, for example, Kuhn, Loudon, Feyerabend, so we're talking about post-Kuhnian philosophers of scientific, post-Kuhnian philosophers of science. So you have a number of, so after Kuhn, philosophers suddenly are talking about anomalies. And they're disagreeing with Kuhn or they're building on Kuhn. So Larry Loudon, the famous Feyerabend, and Salmon, they all follow Kuhn in contending that scientific anomalies cannot be recognized as such in the absence of an at least tentative alternative theory. This is really important because they're agreeing with Kuhn that until you have another theory that's competing with the theory that the anomaly is, shall we say, threatening or posing as a potential counterexample to, you only see it as a puzzle. You won't see it as actually a threat to the theory. So that's a very sort of an expansion of the Kuhnian view. Then there are others like Humphreys, and this is not the famous Humphreys. This is another Humphreys who's been lost to obscurity because he was writing at the time of Kuhn, and he was a logical empiricist, and it was kind of fatal. But he wrote a book on anomalies, one of the few people talking about it, has a footnote talking about Kuhn, but he got lost in the sudden expansion of Kuhn's ideas. Lakatos and Darden treat scientific anomalies, I think, in the pre-Kuhnian fashion as a variety. Their accounts differ of failed predictions. So where am I going? So here's a heads up where I'm going. I reject both of these claims about scientific anomalies, and I think that these claims capture the view among philosophers of science since Kuhn and before Kuhn about scientific anomalies. How do I reject it? I think scientific anomalies can be recognized as such even in the absence of a tentative rival theory. That's very important. That's the sense in which I think they drive scientific discovery. You don't have to wait for an Einsteinian theory of gravity in order to see there's a problem with the precession of the perihelion of Mercury. And you can see it as a threat, not just a puzzle that will be solved within the context of Newton's theory. I'm going to talk about that more in a minute. And not all scientific anomalies involve failed predictions. So you can see that both of these points disagree with the position of, my predecessors. So let's start this process by looking at some historical examples of scientific anomalies. I think I have too many here, and I have a lot of scientists in the audience, so I'm going to do something like move through these examples rapidly, pointing to what the pertinent characteristics are. And afterwards, if anybody wants to in the Q&A ask questions about the details of these examples, we can do it. So there's the famous anomalous precession of the perihelion of Mercury and the discovery of a new theory of gravity, general relativity. And then there's the Hubble expansion anomaly. And some people call it the discovery of dark energy. Then there's the anomalous fish and the discovery that whales are mammals. Even the great Linnaeus initially thought that whales were fish. Interesting enough, Aristotle knew they weren't. I think that's interesting. The anomalous glacial deposits and discovery of the ice ages. And that actually didn't really get settled until the first part of the 20th century. The anomalous tiny bacteria and discovery of giant viruses. The experiment that never worked and the discovery of ribozymes. The faster-than-light neutrino anomaly. The last two are really interesting because they illustrate a transition. The faster-than-light neutrino anomaly reveals something that people thought was an anomaly, and it became recognized as not real. It was illusory. And then there's the anomalous phenomena of ball lightning, which has made the transition from illusion to anomaly. And it's going to play, whether or not you recognize a puzzling phenomena as real is the first step in viewing it as being a potential anomaly worthy of scientific discovery. So I'm going to go through these really quickly. The anomalous orbit of Mercury in light of Newton's theory of gravity. Here is the orbit predicted by Newton's theory of gravity. And this is actually not the orbit because it's too perfect, but the salient point is that the orbit precesses, it rotates. And that was a deep puzzle because how do you explain that? Mercury, the closest planet to the sun, how do you explain that? And rather than seeing this as a threat to Newton's theory of gravity, the claim was, well, we can solve this problem if, in fact, there is another planet. Here's the Vulcanoid joint. They even gave it a name. They were so sure it existed. Vulcan, between Mercury and the sun. This had worked with the discovery of Neptune, the perturbation in the orbit of Uranus had led to the discovery of Neptune. They calculated where a gravitational mass had to be in order to do that. They discovered Neptune. They tried that with the Vulcan, and they couldn't find it. Telescopes got better, they couldn't find one, and they said, well, maybe it's really weird. The sun is always between Vulcan and the Earth, so you can't see it. It's intrinsically invisible. And then people said, that's pretty ad hoc, because it had to be a really weird planet. And somebody said, well, no, maybe it's not that. Maybe the sun's mass isn't homogeneous, and it goes bloop, bloop, and drags Mercury in this weird way. What you see here is what Kuhn talked about, the dogmatism of science. What you're not willing to do is give up Newton's theory. You're thinking of all the extraneous possibilities that could be used to save basically Newton's theory in the context of the observation of the precession of the perihelion of Mercury. This is a typical, and I'm going to go through the other examples faster, this is a kind of stereotypical example of how scientists typically respond to anomalies, and why Kuhn said they're invisible until you have an alternative like general relativity. I don't think that's true, but this is, Kuhn uses this example and others to argue for it. That's why it's important. And of course, we know now that Einstein's theory solves it. Newton was wrong. He had a wrong theory of gravity. And unlike Newton, who believed space was Euclidean and had no causal effect on matter, Einstein believes that space is warped, and it warps more around a massive gravitational body than a body that's less massive. So let's move to another example. So this is a case where you have an anomaly vis-a-vis a theory. So let's look at the Hubble expansion anomaly, which challenges, I'm going to go through it quickly because I have a lot of these examples and I want to get to the really radical ones. Challenges Einstein's theory of gravity. This is, by the way, a quote from, I took right off of NASA's page. And so it's nice because basically the Hubble expansion anomaly was discovered in 1998 using the new Hubble Space Telescope. And it was kind of shocking because people expected that the expansion of the universe from a hot and dense origin would be actually decreasing as time went on. But what they discovered was it was actually increasing. Utterly baffling. How do you explain that? Well, one way to do that was to say that the space is filled with this kind of invisible energy, because the galaxies are still spiraling fast apart from each other, even though they're separated by vast distances. So there's got to be some kind of weird energy pervading space. They called it dark energy. To get it to work consistent with general relativity, it had to be 70% of the energy in the universe, and it had to be invisible because we don't see it. Does that strike anybody like Vulcan? It has a certain smell, shall we say, Vulcanesque smell. And yet it's widely accepted now. Why? Well, because if such energy existed, and it's very hard to show it doesn't exist, why? Since you can't observe it directly, then it would explain, consistent with general relativity, the expansion of the universe where it's actually not decreasing. So that's a really nice example. If we look at these three possibilities, maybe it's a result. So Einstein took care of these kinds of problems with, of course, his famous cosmological constant. And the dark energy really is a kind of fleshing out of the mysterious cosmological constant. And of course, the third possibility, maybe it's like the Newton case. Something's wrong with Einstein's theory of gravity, and we need a new theory of gravity. That's not the option they took, just like in the case of Newton's theory, that's not the option that they took. So I'm going to start moving faster because I'm going to go through these quickly. So another interesting example is the anomalous, even Linnaeus in the late 18th and 19th century identified, and you can see this here, on this side here, identified basically whales as fish. Why? On the basis of their external morphology. And at that time, biological taxonomy was based on external morphology. What's interesting about this is it's kind of consistent with the This is pre-Darwin, the view that God created all the organisms well adapted to their environments at one time, so all that counts as morphology. Linnaeus knew that the internal structure of whales more closely resembles mammals than it does fish. So it was an anomaly for this system because the rest of the system didn't have that discrepancy between external morphology and internal structure. And eventually, Linnaeus came around to classifying whales as mammals, but there was a great deal of resistance to it. Once Darwin came on the scene, everything changed, and we could understand why whales were really mammals in a way that you couldn't pre-Darwin. So that's another really an interesting example. And another one I really like is I think is a really good illustration of this, is the anomalous glacial deposits, which were found, and people recognize this in the late 19th century. They knew what glacial deposits looked like in Switzerland, and they could see that there was evidence that you had at very low latitudes glaciation, massive glaciations. But how in the world could it be possible? The glaciers, were up fairly high in latitude. They were near in northern Canada, and yet we see in New York and Missouri glacial deposits. What do I mean by glacial deposits? Well, everybody's familiar with that. You have the striations, you have the moraines, you have the erratics, the varves. I'm not going to go into detail, but that was very puzzling for them. How could have there been ice that far south? And most people actually rejected the ice ages, and there were two dogmas. And here we're moving on. That anomaly can challenge a dogma, and there are a lot of dogmas in science. I gave a talk at Harvard on this, and I had two physicists furious with me. There are no dogmas in science, especially physics. So I think that I found that very amusing. But at any rate, dogmas are prevalent throughout science, and I can give you lots of examples. And I think Kuhn forgot about dogmas. Dogmas are not as deeply entrenched as theories. So they are easier to see that a dogma is, it's easier for an anomaly to be seen as anomalous when it's challenging a dogma versus a fundamental theory. And if you go to fields other than fundamental physics, the planetary science or geology, you see more dogmas than you do fundamental theory. So it becomes very interesting. So here are the two dogmas that challenged the idea that there were these ice ages where there was massive sheets of ice. There were Laurentide ice sheets during the Pleistocene. The balance of nature, this is the dogma. Natural processes making the Earth in a stable state of equilibrium. Deviations are always short-term and always followed by a return to the same climate equilibrium. That was a dogma. It was very popular in the 19th century, and many of you have heard of uniformitarianism, the idea that geological forces operating on Earth are continuous and uniform. They do not vary over time. So these dogmas are what made it so difficult for scientists to see that, in fact, we had a genuine anomaly. And I want to move on to another dogma, more recent, the anomalous tiny bacteria. So these bacteria, they called them bacteria then, but they're actually giant viruses, were found inside amoeba located in a water tower in 1992 when people were investigating an outbreak of Legionnaire's disease. And you can see them here in the amoeba, and they're very tiny. Look at all these little buggers. Here's an expanded one. And they classified them as bacteria because they were much larger than any viruses that were then known. And the view was viruses wouldn't be that big. Why? Because they didn't require all the genetic mechanisms and other organelles required for a bacterial cell, or an archaea cell for that matter, because they basically parasitize a bacterium or a multicellular eukaryote, or a single-celled eukaryote for that matter, and they can use their genetic machinery to reproduce. So they really don't metabolize and they don't reproduce on their own. So what's really interesting about this is if you look here, here's the sort of typical view of what a virus, the size of a virus at this time. This is the size of the Mimi virus. It was found in the amoeba. And as soon as people, it took 11 years for people to actually take it seriously that these were viruses, but once they did, suddenly they're exploring all kinds of larger viruses. This is the biggest one so far found, and you can see it's approaching the size of an E. coli bacterium, which is really interesting. But it took, and it's very much like some of the cases Kuhn gives, it took, recognizing that these things were actually viruses, and suddenly you see them everywhere. Now, they must have seen those previously, right? But they didn't recognize them for what they represented because they were not prepared to see viruses that were large. So one of my favorite examples is the discovery of catalytic RNA by Tom Cech, who won the Nobel Prize with Sidney Altman for this discovery, and he's at CU Boulder, so I've talked to him about this. And there's something called the central dogma of molecular biology. So I want to say the first thing, that's very controversial. People claim Crick said it. Crick claimed, well, that's not what I meant. I don't care about that. What I care about is that a lot of biochemists I've talked to believe that the central dogma said that basically you have this division of labor between nucleic acids and proteins. Nucleic acids store hereditary information. Proteins do the catalytic and the structural work. And so you can't really have, on this view, a nucleic acid functioning as an enzyme or a catalyst. And so what happened was that Cech and his team at Boulder, he was just a postdoc at the time, were investigating cutting and splicing when an RNA molecule is being assembled from a DNA template. He had a sample of broken up DNA, and he was interested in what protein was basically splicing the pieces together. He was sure it was a protein because of the central dogma. It couldn't be the RNA was replicating. Why? Because it had to have a protein to basically splice it together. And so he was finding, and he couldn't understand it, he was finding splicing products in a sample of RNA, cut up RNA, that he thought was pure, that had no proteins. So as soon as he saw this, he thought, well, it must, because his original idea is to get all this basically cut up RNA, and then he would introduce various protein enzymes and see which one spliced it together, right? Then he'd know the protein that was doing the splicing. But he was getting splicing before the experiment ever got started. And what he did then was he decided there must be some kind of bizarre protein that was attached to the RNA that he couldn't get rid of. And he heated it up and he used various chemicals to break up, to denature proteins. Nothing worked. He kept getting splicing. And he put it away for a year because he just couldn't figure out what was going. And then his team and he, after a year, they went back and they said, gee, could it be the RNA? But the dogma, and by the way, I love that word, central dogma. Some people think I shouldn't have, I kind of misinterpreted that too, but it doesn't matter. The point is, this is a dogma. There's nothing in biochemical theory that says that basically RNA and nucleic acids couldn't function as enzymes. And here's a wonderful quote from basically Cech and his team. And he really expresses it, the part in yellow, that we took this hypothesis. Our first hypothesis was splicing activity was a protein tightly bound, perhaps even, this is bizarre, covalently bonded. That's how wild his theorizing was getting to preserve this dogma to the pre-RNA isolate from the microorganism that he was using. This would have to be a very unusual protein-RNA complex to survive the multiple forms of abuse to which we had subjected it. That we took this hypothesis seriously provides indication of how deeply we're steeped in the prevailing wisdom that only proteins are capable of highly efficient and specific biological catalysis. So there he's telling you that the role the dogma played, it delayed the discovery of basically ribozymes for a year. And he almost lost the Nobel Prize because Sidney Altman was also on it. Then there's faster than light neutrino anomaly that wasn't an actual anomaly. You've all heard about that. I'm not going to go into detail about it, but they basically a group of scientists in the opera detector seemed to see what looked like basically faster than light neutrinos. And they, of course, this would violate special relativity, so there was a lot of excitement. But later, 2012 in July, they discovered two flaws in their equipment: a fiber optics cable attached improperly and a clock oscillator ticking too fast that caused the apparent faster than light measurement. So here's an example where what seems to be an anomaly then is resolved as not an anomaly. But then there's another good example, the anomalous character of ball lightning. I'm not going to go into detail. I think ball lightning is really interesting. But for a long time, it was viewed as illusory. I was particularly interested because my father-in-law saw it in Canada when he was a teenager. And it's basically a sphere in an intense thunderstorm. It was almost the size of a melon, a cantaloupe. And it basically, during the storm, this glowing sphere rolled into the cabin door, which was open, rolled into a vat of water. This is a classic description, boiled it off and rolled out again. Nobody believed this could be real. But now a bunch of physicists have seen it. And sometimes it's small, sometimes it's big, and it's being explored. There have been a number of articles in Nature on that. We have a physicist that's writing an article on ball lightning in our book on anomalies in science. And here's a case where something that seemed just too implausible to be real is now viewed as real and being scientifically investigated. But until you view a phenomenon as real, it's not going to be scientifically investigated. And I want to pull this together now and quickly tell you, basically, we're going to draw some lessons from what we've seen, very non-Kuhnian lessons. A scientific anomaly is a phenomenon that resists explanation within a prevailing set of well-entrenched scientific beliefs, not just a Kuhnian paradigm. Anomalies may manifest as surprising failed predictions. Mercury's orbit and the Hubble expansion anomaly. They can be phenomena that challenge scientific dogma. Giant viruses and catalytic byproducts in a sample of pure RNA oligomers. Phenomena that fall outside prevailing categorization schemas. Whales, and I could talk about fast radio bursts. There's a lot of astronomical phenomena that do this, and Steve Dick, whom some of you know is NASA's, for many years, NASA's official historian, is really interested in astronomical categorizations, and he says they're everywhere. I mean, it starts with quasars. They've been kind of solved now as basically, in the cores of very highly energetic black holes, but fast radio bursts are just a lot of the stuff out there that just like, what the heck is that? And finally, phenomena acknowledged as real by the scientific community, but that persist in resisting explanations such as ball lightning. So basically, Kuhn focused only on this. And there's all of this other set of categories that are involved in, basically generating anomalies. So there are three stages, it seems to me, in which anomalies scientifically explored and eventually resolved. First, there's the acknowledgement by the pertinent scientific community that a natural phenomena, observed event, object, or process is real and scientifically puzzling. That is, difficult to explain in terms of widely accepted, well-entrenched scientific beliefs, theory, dogma, or classification of schemes. Second, acknowledgement the puzzling phenomena is at least potentially anomalous, vis-a-vis a widely accepted set of scientific beliefs. That scientifically plausible efforts to explain it in keeping with scientific theory and dogma or categories have been unsuccessful. This involves taking seriously the possibility that current theory, dogma, or classification schemes may need revision or replacement instead of persisting in trying to resolve the anomaly with increasing ad hoc conjectures, think Vulcan, or covalently bonded protein to RNA. Note, not all potential anomalies, faster than light neutrinos, turn out to be actual anomalies vis-a-vis a pertinent body of scientific beliefs. Finally, acknowledgement that the potentially anomalous phenomena is actually anomalous, which occurs when the pertinent dogma, theory, and categorization scheme is revised or replaced. The precession of perihelion Mercury, vis-a-vis Newton's theory, but not general relativity. The point is, that the precession of perihelion and Mercury is only anomalous vis-a-vis Newton's gravitational theory. It is not anomalous vis general relativity. And so that, again, shows you that there's no such thing as an anomaly per se. It's always in the context of a certain set of scientific beliefs. So, food for thought. How much time do I have? 10 minutes? Okay, I want to go through some contemporary candidates for potentially scientific anomalies. And what I'm going to do is, when it looks like I'm going to run out of time, I'm going to go to the Viking missions. So I keep my promise to talk about the search for extraterrestrial life. So we're going to look at, these are just some cases I think are particularly interesting. And I'm going to go through them now, as many of them as I can get through. So I've written with Bob Hazen, a mineralogist, and one of his postdocs, Morrison. I wrote a paper that appeared in PNAS, and it's basically on, historical science and mineralogy. So it's really interesting that the current IMA, International Mineralogical Association, classifies minerals, and it claims to be a classification schema for all condensed materials. All condensed materials. That's the idea, all solids. And that classification scheme is based on crystalline structure and major elemental composition. Now, the problem with this is that crystalline structure and major elemental composition is very uninformative if you're doing historical science, if you're trying to reconstruct planetary histories. Why? Because a lot of the information, if you're trying to reconstruct the past, whether it's on Earth or on another planet, is in the imperfections in the crystal and the contaminants, or the trace minerals, all of which are ignored in mineralogy. So, for example, there are diamonds produced around highly energetic stars. They're tiny, tiny things. There are two ways in which diamonds are produced in the Earth's mantle. And on top of that, you can produce diamonds by industrial processes. These are all different ways of producing diamonds, but they're all diamonds by the IMA system of classification. A good system of classification should be able to give you important and informative regularities. But if you're doing historical science or planetary science, that's not what the IMA system does. And you can really see this especially with regard to volcanic glasses. So here are 4 different types of volcanic glasses. The one here is, I probably will mispronounce it, sideromelane. This is, of course, pumice. This is obsidian. And I probably am going to mispronounce this, tachyolite. It's all volcanic glasses. They look as different as rubies and sapphires, right? Which aren't actually that different. It turns out that's all, the classification there is due to contaminants. And so when people, when the IMA system was first suggested, you had a complete reordering of mineral classifications. For example, jade included what we now call nephrite. Jadeite and nephrite look so much alike in terms of crystalline form and color that you'd think they were the same chemical, but they're not, because it turns out they have different molecular structures. So it's really interesting how the introduction of the IMA system did reclassification. But these are all not classified by the IMA system. They lie outside of its classification. And yet many planets, terrestrial planets, the bulk of them is volcanic glasses, right? And so, Earth, 50% of the minerals on Earth are biogenic. You're not going to see those on a world that doesn't have biology. So this is a really problematic system, and these are anomalies in that system. They might, and it doesn't bother the IMA people at all. I think they're back with Linnaeus, when you're just classifying things kind of crudely, as Linnaeus did. And they're a lot like whales, and I think they're a lot like whales and fish versus mammals, and I think that we're long due, and Bob Hazen's been trying to come up with a new classification system for minerals. Then there are the Jupiter mass objects, which are really bizarre, and they challenge current theories of planet formation, because you have these 40 pairs have been discovered of Jupiter-sized objects. Some of them are up to 13 times the mass of Jupiter, some are 0.6, a half the size of Jupiter. They orbit around each other, have been observed with a James Webb telescope. They do not orbit a star. How the heck did these things come into being? So they're deeply puzzling, and they're anomalies given current theories of planet formation. The seismic blobs, which are kind of dear to my heart, but I no longer am so sure that they're very good anomalies, so we're going to skip through them quickly. But I just want to point out that they're they're specialists in this audience that I've been talking all morning with, that these blobs basically are between the core and the mantle, and they're really weird and they're hard to understand, but I think I've been convinced that they're probably best understood as subducted oceanic crust. The new anomaly that I think is much more interesting than this, and I think I'm losing this thing, is the Devonian magnetism record, which is just very strange. But I want to go on. I don't want to get stuck here. Then I've written a paper with Paul Rimmer on ammonia and phosphine in the clouds of Venus as potentially biological anomalies. It came out a couple of years ago. And it is, the presence of phosphine gas in the atmosphere of Venus. Is it real was the first question. There's a lot of debate about whether it's real. I'm losing my, I think it'll still be okay. And if it's real, then it's a potentially biological anomaly. Is it an anomaly? Is it really going to show us that clouds of Venus have a form of life? It's got to be really different than our form of life? Not necessarily. The point is that potentially biological anomalies are a potential source of scientific discovery. That doesn't mean that it's life. It means it's worthy investigating for a novel form of life. That's all it means. And then there is, here we go, I'm getting radical, I told you, the Allen Hills meteorite. The bacteria-shaped structures and chains of magnetite crystals discovered in the 1990s with the Allen Hills meteorite, 84001. It was discovered in 84, first one picked out of Antarctica, and it challenged a dogma about the potential size of biological cells. Now, I'm not saying that these are fossilized Martian life, but one of the major objections to there being fossilized Martian life is they're too small to be cells, and they were claimed to be cells. That kind of argument, I think, is exactly the kind of argument you see when people are trying to resist considering the possibility that we have a genuine biological anomaly in this case. And so what I would urge in cases like this is that we consider that yeah, it may be abiotic, but we also investigate the possibility that it's biological. Usually what you find is that only one side is investigated very seriously, and that is the abiotic. Why? Because the biotic one is so radical. I mean, it's like the giant viruses in reverse, right? It's challenging a dogma about the potential sizes of biological cells. I told you I'd get radical. UAPs. Okay, UAPs are real phenomena. I think that's been established. That's why suddenly there's so much interest in it. That's why Avi Loeb has his Galileo project at Harvard. And most scientists are embarrassed by even mentioning it. How many people here are embarrassed when I say UAP? UFO? Anybody here? No? Well, there are people who go, oh my God, Avi Loeb, he's gone off, and he's a astrophysicist at Princeton. He's gone off, not Princeton, at Harvard. He's gone off the deep end, people make fun of him. And yet, there are 3% of UAPs that can't be scientifically explained. The military admits that. Everybody pays attention to, there are all these others that can be explained, right? 97%. But what about that 3%? That's really interesting about those 3%. And they've been identified using multiple sensors, optical, radio frequency, and infrared. It's not like when the UFOs were originally identified just with basically, visual of pilots and radar. Now they're being, basically triangulated with the object is being seen in multiple sensors, and that suggests a real phenomena as opposed to some sort of atmospheric or instrumental interaction with the atmosphere artifacts. And they exhibit movement patterns that violate aspects of our current theoretical understanding of how natural, non-living objects move under natural conditions. They move against the wind. They abruptly change directions. They abruptly stop. They rapidly accelerate. I'm not saying they're UFOs. They might be weird natural phenomena that we just don't understand. But you'll never know if you don't investigate them, if you just assume they can't be real. And so that's part of the lesson here. And now I get to the very topic that I promised you that would relate to the original title of this talk, which is the results of the Viking labeled release biology experiments. I think they represent a potential biological anomaly. And I think, and that's what I argue in my book, in chapter 8 especially, that if you really want to basically discover unfamiliar forms of life, life that is not just like our form of life. And we had talked later about how it's very hard to detect anything that's microbial, and most life in the universe is probably microbial, using the techniques currently used by microbiology, cultivation, microscopy, and various hybridization techniques. All of those techniques would not detect a form of life that was very different in our form of life. So how are you going to detect it? Well, my answer is you look for a potentially biological anomaly using tentative, not defining criteria. And so the Allen Hills meteorite gives you an example of an anomaly which has been ignored for more than 40 years. So the anomalous character of the results of the Viking LR biology experiment. The Martian soil, it's a labeled release experiment, so the basic idea is you had a nutrient solution that you would wet a sample of Martian soil with, and you'd look, because it was radioactively labeled, if you got metabolism, and they were working with a metabolic definition, so their experiments were designed around that. If you wet the soil with a carbohydrate solution, and it has Martians, and they metabolize it, then they would release radioactively labeled carbon dioxide gas. And they ran this test with microbes on Earth. This was before they knew that only 5% of microbes on Earth can be cultivated when they did this. This was early on. It was kind of a shocker. They thought they knew what microbes on Earth ate, and so they got a solution that they thought all the cultivated because they thought they were able to cultivate them all, microbes would eat. And they got the result that they were told they should get with their definition, which was the metabolic definition. Basically, you had the release of a radioactively labeled carbon dioxide gas. The Martian soil, they had one control experiment planned, which is to heat the soil to 160 degrees for 3 hours, a temperature high enough to kill any known bacteria, and it failed to release more gas. So Levin and Stratt, who were the PIs of the experiment, they had champagne actually in the refrigerator. And they were a few steps away from the refrigerator because they thought they'd found Martian life. They really did. But then things kind of went south. A second injection, so they thought, let's run, it hadn't been planned, but they said, let's take and give those hungry little Martian microbes, not the ones that had been heated up, but the other sample, another helping. And they expected it would release radioactively labeled carbon dioxide gas because the little buggers are hungry now, right? And we're giving them some more food. Instead, what happened was approximately 30% of the gas in the chamber was reabsorbed by the soil. Baffling. They had no way of explaining either biotically or abiotically why that would occur. It was just completely unexpected and difficult to explain. And so then they judged, well, you know that LR experiment? We had run the experiment on Earth microbes, and if you looked at the curve, the release of the radioactively labeled carbon dioxide gas was too quick. It was faster than on Earth. So now you see the metabolic definition is being made even more rigid, right? It has to go and metabolize at the same rate that Earth microbes do. And we have the same kind of trick, I'm going to call it trick, that we played with Vulcan, right? And Mercury. It's the same kind of thing. So you're you say, well, it can't be Martian life, therefore, well, actually, I'm ahead of myself. The key to the whole thing was the results of the GCMS, and I'm going to go back in a minute. So what then are you going to base it on, since you've got these weird results? It's an anomaly. And so NASA said, well, the GCMS didn't find any organic molecules, so couldn't be life. Must be an inorganic product that is producing these results. And of course, what's really interesting, NASA's never changed its position officially from that. And they then talked about this, became a big deal. They said, well, it was too much too soon. But that was, this order should be, after they couldn't find organic molecules. Of course, now everybody knows there are organic molecules in the soil of Mars. And there is abiological candidates for what everybody is sure is a mysterious Martian oxidant that's not the product of life, has been explored over the years: hydrogen peroxide, superoxide, exotic states of iron, and more recently perchlorate, which was discovered by the Phoenix lander in 2008. But here's the problem with perchlorate. It becomes a potent oxidizer at 200 degrees Celsius. It can't explain the results of the LR experiment because the chamber was at 10 degrees Celsius. But it can explain the failure of the GCMS to find organic molecules, which we now know exist, because it was heated, the samples were heated to 500 degrees Celsius. And yet, the official word is not that, hey, this is a potentially biological anomaly. We ought to go back and take another look. We ought to figure out what that mysterious oxidant is. It's viewed officially as settled, although there are a number of scientists, including Chris McKay, who have argued that it's not settled. But the important point is that life is an oxidant. And why the emphasis on the non-living oxidant as opposed to the possibility of a living oxidant? If you treat this as a potentially biological anomaly, you look at both. You consider both possibilities. You don't shut down the one that is most disturbing to you, as happened with all of the other cases I mentioned, the giant viruses, basically the perturbation of the orbit of Mercury, etc. The truth is neither side, I'm almost done. Yeah, I'm just almost there. The truth is neither side of the debate over the LR experiment knew what they found. The results of the LR experiment were potentially biological anomalous, and had they been treated as such, both possibilities, biotic and abiotic, would have been seriously entertained and explored, which has not happened. So, what I'm arguing now, Kuhn was wrong. You can recognize anomalies independently of massive theory change or radical change in your ideas. So let's speed up the process of scientific discovery by hunting for them and scientifically investigating potentially anomalies. So actually search phenomena that are potentially anomalous. Don't look for the stuff that you expect. Look for the unexpected that conflict with theories, and it's easier to do with dogma. Theories are a real problem, but dogmas and classification schemes, you can hunt for anomalies. Acknowledge the potential anomalousness of a natural phenomenon when scientifically plausible efforts to explain it persist in failing. It doesn't mean the phenomena is actually anomalous. It may be resolved eventually as non-anomalous, but if you always pursue it as non-anomalous, you'll never discover it. It'll take a long time to get there. And here's the most relevant, this is the end, the relevant to science education. So here is a abstract from an interesting paper that was written by a bunch of educators in 1993. And we did a test to how science students respond to anomalous data. So they created a theory, and then they created the data, and they asked students then to evaluate the data. And what they found is there are 7 distinct forms of response to anomalous data, only one of which is to accept the data and change the theories. All of the students wanted to reject the data or argue there was some other factor involved. And I think that shows that science education itself needs to be less focused on getting the right answer, as I remember from my science experiences when I was in a lab and you would get the right answer, and if you didn't, they said you'd go back and figure out what went wrong with your experiment. But also there should be training about, how to recognize when things go wrong and something really important is in the wings. And I want to just give thanks to the 2 grants that have supported this, one from the National Science Foundation, the other from the Templeton Foundation. And we had an anomaly in science discussion group. Ed Turner, an astrophysicist at Princeton, Steve Dick, NASA's official historian and astronomer, and Wes Waters, an astronomer at Wellesley. We had a long, it was over several months talk, and they both have papers in the upcoming volume that Michael Dietrich and I are writing. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Cleland. And I'm told to go up on the stage.
Okay.
Well, this is definitely a lot of food for thought, and we will take some questions if there are some, not too many because we are over time. Questions?
When we talk about this life on Mars, aren't we not falling in the trap of dogma again between organic and inorganic?
Say that, I didn't hear the last part.
When we talk about chemistry, organic and inorganic chemistry, isn't that one of the dogmas which we
I would
trapped
agree.
in?
Yes, I would agree. I would agree. Because there are several ways to interpret what you said. Of course, the whole idea of organic chemistry is just carbon containing. I assume you mean organic and this is biotic? Yeah. Okay.
I think.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Especially if you go to Venus or Titan, my favorite place.
I had a question about a very interesting talk, by the way. And in the age of computer modeling, which sort of postdates a lot of this philosophical underpinning of what you spoke about, you can make a theory, quite believable through three-dimensional simulations of the physics. And I've noticed a kind of a bandwagoning onto theories kind of accelerating because you can see it in a model much more convincingly than you could write about it 50 years ago. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that.
So that's a really good question, and we actually have in our book, plugging the book at this stage, that Michael Dietrich and I are putting together this collection. We have a data scientist who's actually writing about, in data science, big data investigations, which you're talking about. In the big data, they distinguish, this thing is falling off again, they distinguish between outliers and anomalies. And one of the big deals, how can you distinguish an outlier from an anomaly? So that's a really big issue. The other issue is people have argued that big data gets rid of the need for theories, right? That all you need to do is then have your computer go and give you some generalizations based on that. But of course, that's flawed because when you collect big data, you make various assumptions about what's relevant. So if you're actually looking for amino acids, you're not going to have equipment. You might have a lot of data on amino acids, but you're not going to have equipment for nucleobases. And so one of the problems of the big data movement is that it ignores the role of background assumptions in the actual way in which you decide to collect the data. So I don't know whether I answered your question, but I think the big data movement is interesting, but it's not clear that you can distinguish outliers from anomalies, and it's also, and that's a big problem. I mean, how do you tell an outlier from an anomaly? And of course, if you say it's an anomaly, you've got to have some kind of generalization, whether it's a dogma or a theory, in the background that you're testing, and that's why you designed the experiment with those particular data being collected versus other data. Yeah. So I'm not impressed with big data movement.
Clint?
We have kind of an idea that there should be habitable planets out there, but we've never actually discovered one. And so I've just wondered, is that an example of sort of dogma in a way? Because it's an idea that we have, and it hasn't been
Well, but I think in that particular case, it's really pretty data poor, right? I mean, we believe that there are planets that are in the, shall I say, habitable zone for our form of life out there, right? And we don't know whether or not the Goldilocks zone, as they call it, for our form of life, is the only form of life out there. There may be other forms of life that are more tolerant. So, but we do know there are planets in that zone. And so one of the assumptions we make is that that's all that's required, right, is being, I'm exaggerating, but something like that's all that's required for being, a living thing. And I think for microbes that may be true, but then one is always reminded that there were like almost 3 billion years, probably there were 3 billion years in which all we had was microbes, right? So some kinds of life are harder to make probably than others, and we don't know those conditions that were required. So I think we're not in, I think that it depends whether you're looking for life like ours or you're looking for life in general. If you're really wanting to find life that might be different than ours, then I think that's an assumption that there are habitable planets within that zone is a misleading assumption. But I think it's not an unreasonable assumption at this stage.
I see what you mean, but I wonder if, is this an example of, since it's so data poor, is it an example of a case where we don't have a theory yet?
But we don't have enough data for there to be said to be a anomaly that suggests that there aren't habitable planets out there, right? I mean, the alternative.
Yeah, so there is not an anomaly to question yet.
No. I mean, look at the discovery of ribozymes, right? There was a very specific claim about, you couldn't get nucleic acids to function as catalysts, right? So there, you really had something that looked like a counter instance to that claim. And the same with the giant viruses. It was just too big, and yet it turned out that there was some evidence that it was actually not a bacterium. And so that's a very different condition than just thinking there might be habitable planets out there. Yeah.
Okay, with this, let's thank Professor Cleland one more time. And we will resume the Kepler lectures in the next semester. So all of you have a nice summer.